All right, and then a quick reminder, if you don't already, there's physical copies of the reading plan right out these doors across from the bathroom on that credenza, or every Saturday when I send the email, it's usually attached to the bottom of the email. You can find that on Facebook as well, but this will take us through July, and then we're set to finish Deuteronomy mid-fall, so mid-October is when we'll finish it, so I'll produce another one there as we get there. All right, so this morning, I've really enjoyed the last several weeks of Deuteronomy. Really enjoyed the feasts. I was surprised by that personally. I mean, I enjoy studying. I'm always enjoying that, but I was just really enjoying studying the feasts. I think it was just rich stuff to dig into. Really started to shape some things, change some things, just help you see things in different ways. I really enjoy that. We're done with the feasts in Deuteronomy at this point. And so as we are continuing to press on through Deuteronomy, Moses has some other things now that he wants to address. It's really important that the people of God represent God. It's really important that the people of God reflect God, right? And Moses is trying to help these people understand, what does that look like? Now, one of the greatest ways that the people of God can reflect their God is in the pursuit of righteousness and the upholding of justice. What does it look like, though, to uphold justice in a world that's redefining justice? And it's not new to us, because the people of God, Israel, were going to go into a group of people surrounded by some nations who their idea of justice was different, because their idea of justice was based on their gods, little g. So what does it look like to pursue righteousness and uphold justice so that we then reflect the character of our God? That's a very rough introduction, but we're just jumping in. Here's where I'm going this morning. Righteousness is the foundation for justice. Justice upheld maintains righteousness. There's a bit of a cycle here. Do you see it? Righteousness is the foundation for justice. It's how I know what is just and what is unjust. Righteousness. And then when justice is upheld, it maintains righteousness. It keeps righteousness as the standard, okay? All right. So here's how we see that. Now, I'm going to do some summarizing this morning. There's some things we're going to get into that I find fascinating, but you will see. The verdict's out. But let's take a look here at Deuteronomy. The first thing we're going to look at, Deuteronomy 16, is the pursuit of righteousness is the foundation of justice. If you want to uphold justice, if you want to know what is just or unjust, you have to pursue righteousness. And then the question becomes, what is righteousness? How do I know, right? Pursuit of righteousness is the foundation of justice. Let's take a look. Deuteronomy 16, verse 18. This is Moses speaking to the people. He says, "You shall appoint judges and officers in all your towns that the Lord your God is giving you, according to your tribes, and they shall judge the people with righteous judgment. You shall not pervert justice. You shall not show partiality. You shall not accept a bribe, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and subverts the cause of the righteous." I feel like I could just scream that one to our country at this point. "Justice and only justice you shall follow, that you may live and inherit the land that the Lord your God is giving you." Okay, these verses are the introduction that then tie the next two sections that we're going to look at together. Moses is calling his people, he's instructing his people, you're to appoint judges and officers. Now, you will see, now this would be like civil officers, this would be judges who are deciding civil cases, but you might remember, I don't remember what year it was, 2017, maybe further back, we went through the book of Judges. And we talked about how the judge, while many of the ones we see in the book of Judges were military leaders, they were raised up to help overcome enemies who had been oppressing Israel, right? They were military leaders. They also had a civil role. In fact, Deborah, one of the judges, we see that primarily with her until she steps up and steps in a military role. But she was judging people under a tree in a certain location, right? So when you think about these judges, this is likely the precursor, the instructions that led to the period of the judges, right? This was before the king, because the king comes next week when we talk about it. The idea was when you get into the land and all the people are spread out, you're going to need to have people help you decide matters. Civil matters, relationship matters, criminal matters, things like that. While they're all gathering together and they're wandering together, and the tabernacle's in the center and the Levitical priests are all around there, they're all centrally located, so they can just go there. But Moses is saying, how do we continue to uphold justice? How do we continue to do that when you're all spread out? You're to appoint judges. And so again, when you think about the judges from the book of Judges, right? You might remember Samson. You might remember. I'm going blank. Ehud. Samson's probably one of the first judges that come to mind for you. Gideon is another very popular judge, right? These are some of the judges. But when you think about them, keep in mind we're getting a very selective portion of what was taking place. So just because we read about Gideon does not mean Gideon was the only judge, nor does it mean Gideon's judging the entire nation. He's the judge that's over a certain area. Samson, same thing. Deborah, same thing. So you might have judges going, operating at certain times, overlapping with one another. The scriptures don't give us everything, right? They just highlight the things that God has for us that we need to understand or that fits the purpose of what he's trying to communicate. But it doesn't mean that's the only thing happening. So judges and officers, civil officers, to decide your cases. All right. They shall judge the people with righteousness. Now, in the brackets, what I've done is this is just an English transliteration. In other words, I took the Hebrew word and just put it in English so you can pronounce it. Tzedek and mishpat. Okay? I'm doing this because I'm about to explain why. They shall judge the people with righteousness. The word is tzedek. Judgment, mishpat. You shall not pervert justice, mishpat, same word, right, as judgment here. You shall not show partiality, and you shall not accept a bribe, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise, subverts the cause of the righteous, tzedek. Justice, tzedek. And only justice, tzedek, you shall follow, that you may live and inherit the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Why did I do that? Because this justice and justice is simply an English translation. I don't like to do this very often, and when I do, I'm trying to show you why I'm doing it. I don't think it's a great translation. Your English translations are very good and very accurate, but we always have to understand it's an English translation, which means it requires an interpretation. Every translation is a group of people, or in some cases one person, who's sitting down and they're looking at the original languages, they're looking at the context, and they're trying to decide, now when I take that and say Hebrew, which is a very robust language, very pictorial, how do I then take that and accurately capture that in English, which is not robust and not pictorial like Hebrew is? English is a very complicated, unnecessarily so, language. And so there's challenges in trying to interpret something, and so they have to make the best decision based on the use of the word and the context, and sometimes it's good and accurate, and sometimes it's not, and that's okay. What I'm about to show you, you can find as you study. BlueLetterBible.org has a great tool. It's called an interlinear. You could find what I'm about to show you just as easily by going to BlueLetterBible.org, pulling up the interlinear verse on these verses, and you can see what are the words behind the words. What's the Hebrew word behind the English? Here's what I'm thinking. He says, the judges shall be the people, they shall judge the people with righteousness, tzedek. Now, this is the correct kind of order. This is about, we could summarize it real simply and say it's about living rightly, but living rightly based on the one who is righteous. Right? So the standard of righteousness is the one who is the righteous one, God. Okay, so if I live in alignment with God's standards, I'm living righteously. Okay, and then righteousness in general is about living in the correct order of things as the righteous one has prescribed it. Okay, so righteousness is about correct order. It's about right living. It's about living in alignment with God and how that reflects his character. Righteousness. Okay, tzedek. And then judgment. So they shall judge the people with righteous judgment. So they shall make decisions and they shall pursue justice. You shall not pervert justice. Okay, so I'm trying to just show you here, there's a different word translating justice here and judgment here, and it's mishpat. Okay, not tzedek. Okay, down here, the righteous, the tzedek, the ones who follow after the Lord, they live their lives in alignment with his character. They live according to the correct order. Now, here's my thinking. So far in this, we've seen tzedek translated as righteous here, and we've seen judgment and justice translating mishpat. We've seen righteousness translated tzedek here. Why the change there? Do you see what I'm saying? Okay, if this is to be translated justice, my expectation would be that the Hebrew word behind it is mishpat, but it's not, it's tzedek. So then I'm asking myself the question, I'm not a Hebrew scholar, I'm asking myself the question though, why make the change? Because if I'm in the context of a paragraph even, then the words they can certainly be changed if the context decides it, right? So tzedek can be translated justice. It certainly can. It's not the primary way it's translated. It's a less common way to translate it, but you can find other places where the context fits it, and you can translate tzedek as justice. So then I'm asking myself, why here though? Why switch all of a sudden when righteousness with tzedek here, righteous with tzedek here, in the very next verse, it's justice as translating tzedek? It doesn't seem to be a reason for me, is what I'm saying to you, to go justice instead of continue with righteousness. Okay? Here's why that matters to me this morning. Because this right here in verse 20 is the summary of the call. Appoint judges, they shall judge righteously, they shall not pervert justice, and then righteousness and only righteousness you shall follow. Because the pursuit of righteousness is the foundation of justice. How do the people know what is just? They pursue righteousness. Okay? How do the people know what's righteous? They got to know their God. They've got to know his Torah, his instruction. Because it's in his Torah, in his instruction, that he reveals his character. It's in his instruction that they hear his voice. He's said that multiple times up to this point. It's in his instruction that they learn how they are supposed to live in the context of a relationship with their God, who's righteous. How do I live in the context of a relationship with a God who is righteous, who has brought me out of slavery, he's redeemed me? How do I live in the context of his presence? How do I live in a relationship with the righteous one? You've got to know his instruction. You've got to know his voice. You've got to know his Torah, his instruction, okay? So righteousness then is the pursuit of the correct order. Righteousness is the pursuit of living in alignment with the one who is righteous. And then as I pursue righteousness and only righteousness, tzedek and only tzedek, then I shall follow, as I follow that, then I shall live in the land that the Lord has given me. How do the people of God maintain what God has given them? You pursue tzedek, righteousness. And then we're going to see you uphold justice. So I'm saying to you this morning, and I don't like to do this often, but I'm telling you where you can find this and go test me on this. And you still may disagree, and that's perfectly okay. Go to blueletterbible.org, go to Deuteronomy 16, verse 20, click on the verse if you're on the app, or there should be a tools menu. Click on interlinear, and it's going to pull up for you the verse word for word. You can see the English word, and in this case, the Hebrew words that translate it. You can track the same thing that I just tracked here. Okay? That's why I'm saying what I'm saying this morning. I'm not trying to undermine your English translation, but I do always want you to know your English translation is simply a translation, which means it requires interpretation, which means there's some things I need to hold a little loosely to. I am not saying hold loosely to the authority of the scriptures. I'm saying your English Bibles, there are some things that you look at them and you go, oh, that's a little weird. That might be an error. And I'm saying to you, it's a translation. When we talk about the scriptures being without error, we don't mean your translation. We mean the original writings, okay? The ones actually penned, okay? All right, that's going to raise questions. You can ask me or email me that. So the pursuit of righteousness, this is the summary for what's to follow. Pursue tzedek, righteousness, and only righteousness. And where do I find righteousness? in the righteous one. That's really important for what follows next. If I pursue the one who is righteous and I seek after him, I follow his law, his instructions, I'm aligning my life with his order, then I will know justice. Then I will recognize injustice, and then I can uphold those things. So now Moses is going to give some examples of what it looks like to execute justice. If you're pursuing righteousness and only righteousness, then you need to execute justice in order to maintain the righteousness. Because if I don't then execute justice, then that righteousness becomes tainted, corrupted. I follow after something else instead. But if I've been pursuing righteousness, and only righteousness, and then I uphold justice, and that righteousness is maintained. The people of God are kept from being corrupted and tainted. Okay? So Moses is going to give some examples of some of the things his people might need to look at when they're executing justice as they get into the land. 16:21. By the way, your chapters and verses are also not inspired. Right? So your chapters, big numbers, the verses, little numbers, they're just helpful tools. They were added in the Middle Ages in the 1500s. They were not part of when they originally wrote the original writings. That wasn't part of it. And so sometimes there's some unhelpful breaks where there shouldn't be breaks. And the way our minds think, we think chapter break, end of thought, end of section, and that's not always the case. Sometimes it just keeps going and someone just made a not so great decision on where they put it. But they're helpful, so thanks for doing that, whoever did that. But just so you have a right perspective on it. Verse 21, 16:21. You shall not plant any tree as an Asherah beside the altar of the Lord your God that you shall make, and you shall not set up a pillar which the Lord your God hates. Chapter 17, verse 1. You shall not sacrifice to the Lord your God an ox or a sheep in which it is a blemish, any defect whatever, for this is an abomination to the Lord your God. So he starts out with some things where this is what it was going to look like to execute justice. You should not do these things, because to pursue righteousness and only righteousness is contrary to these things. Don't plant a tree as an Asherah. Now, I'll talk for a minute about this. The people they were going to live among and in the land they were going to inherit were the Canaanites, and they were then surrounded by all kinds of other people. Now these other nations, they had their gods and goddesses that they worship. Baal is one of them, and Ashtaroth, or sometimes you'll see Asherah, or there's other names I'm about to give you. This is the female counterpart to Baal. Okay, so you got Baal, and then you would have had Ashtaroth, and Ashtaroth is represented by Asherah poles or trees. Now the idea was you would take usually a fir tree, and you would then set that fir tree up as a symbol of honor to Ashtaroth, the female goddess. Now, Ashtaroth was a warrior goddess, and she was a fertility goddess. Okay, so the fir tree never dies, is always green. There's your fertility pictured, okay? All right. So the fir tree was set up. Sometimes they would just carve out things from a tree and they would set it up. The idea here, though, is not simply that you just shouldn't set up these poles, but look where. You shall not plant any tree as an Asherah, as an honoring symbol or a symbol of worship to Ashtaroth, the goddess, beside the altar of the Lord, your God. So do not take a fir tree or a pole that is meant to be an honoring or a worshiping symbol of Ashtaroth, a female goddess that the Canaanites worship. Don't come and put that next to the Lord your God's altar. The idea is this: because I'm trying to syncretize things, because I'm trying to bring in a little bit of that worship, of that god or goddess alongside Yahweh. Because I'm just not sure, maybe. Because I'm just not sure if Yahweh's going to be able to provide for me, so maybe I'm covering all my bases, and so I've got a little representation of every single symbol. Coexist, anyone? It's not good, by the way. I'm not saying it as a good example. I'm just trying to make a connection. All the different religious symbols cannot coexist. Okay? Because they're contrary to one another. Some of them are actively opposing one another. And so you can't have a symbol of one thing that says you should be killing everyone who worships this other thing next to one another. That doesn't work. Okay, but the idea is, don't try to bring in the type of worship of other gods alongside the way you worship your God. Don't mix and meld together. Okay? He's already said this multiple times. Don't worship your Yahweh, your God, the way the other nations worship God, okay? So that's the Asherah pole. We're not even done with her, all right? And then you shall not set up a pillar. The pillar would have oftentimes been a stone pillar, and this would have been representative of Baal, the male, okay? So now, Baal, I know we've got kids. I'm glad there's kids in here, but I'm going to speak in euphemism now, okay? So Baal was a fertility god, and the pillar, just like the fir tree represented fertility, the pillar was like an obelisk, an elongated shape, and it represented fertility as well. He was the male part, she's the female part, and so they oftentimes would go together. There is some fascinating history, if you like this kind of thing, that describes kind of what it looks like to worship these gods. It helps you then to understand the background. When we went through Hosea, I gave you more details than you ever wanted to know on that, but that's out there for you to research and study. But Moses is telling them, this is what it looks like to pursue righteousness and only righteousness. Don't bring in other gods and the worship of other gods. Don't bring them alongside the worship of Yahweh. Don't mix and meld. Keep it separate. And then when you bring sacrifices to Yahweh, they should not have a blemish, okay? Now, he's going to give an example as we keep going, 17:2. 17:2. If there is found among you within any of your towns that the Lord your God has given you, a man or a woman who does what is evil in the sight of the Lord your God, pursue righteousness, only righteousness. How do I know what righteousness is, and how do I then know what to uphold as justice? It's determined by what's right or evil in the sight of the Lord your God. Okay? When you get to the book of Judges, everybody does what's right in their own eyes. That's the problem. Okay? So we're going to keep going here. In the sight of the Lord your God and transgressing his covenant, verse 3, and has gone and served other gods and worshiped them, or the sun, or the moon, or any of the hosts of heaven, which I have forbidden. And it is told to you, and you hear of it, then you shall inquire diligently. And if it is true and certain that such an abomination has been done in Israel, then you shall bring out to your gates that man or that woman who has done this evil thing, and you shall stone that man or woman to death with stones. So this, when you get into the area that you're going to be living, you get word that there's a man or a woman who's going after other gods. You need to diligently look into it. You don't just act on a rumor. You diligently look into it. And he's going to say in a minute, 2 or 3 witnesses. You look into it. If you find it's true, then you need to uphold justice. And upholding justice is bring them out to the gate and stone them to death. Let's talk about what's going on here. If you do what's evil in the sight of the Lord your God, what that looks like in this example is you've gone after other gods and worshiped them. Okay, we just talked about Baal. We've just talked about Ashtaroth. He says, or the sun, or the moon, or any of the hosts of heaven. That'd be the stars. All right, let's talk more about Ashtaroth. Ashtaroth, warrior goddess, fertility goddess. She is well known in many different cultures, but she goes by different names. That's the way the pagan religions work with all the different gods and goddesses, is the same god might get translated to a different name in a different setting or a different language, right? And so you might have the same god, and so I think like a good example might be Zeus in Greek is, I think, equivalent with Saturn in another language, or something like that, right? But same god, but different languages. Okay, so Ashtaroth can also be known by other names. Some of these you'll find in the Bible, some of these you'll just recognize from Greek mythology. She can be known as Astarte. That's where we get the word Easter from, by the way. In Babylon, she's known as Ishtar. Okay. In Ephesus, when Paul was in Ephesus, you find this in Acts chapter 18, 19. You see there's a temple of Diana. Diana is also linked to Ashtaroth. Artemis, same one, okay? So they're all the same person. They might have variations based on the culture because each culture puts their own twist on things, but the idea is this is the female goddess. She's a warrior goddess. She's a fertility goddess, and she's worshipped in ways that would be appropriate to a fertility goddess. Can I say that? Okay? There's some things that take place that must not take place among the people of God, really among anyone, but definitely not among the people of God, okay? There is defilement. There are some things where, what's funny, you know that Michael Jackson song, Dirty Diana. Oh. Okay, that came in my mind when I thought about Diana, and I think that's a good picture of what it might look like to worship Diana. It's dirty. I'm not saying that's from the Lord, it just popped in my mind. So, this is Ashtaroth. So to worship her was to defile yourself and anyone else you were involved in. She also was linked to moon worship. Oftentimes, male gods are linked to sun worship, and Baal, you can find places where he is indeed linked to worship of the sun. And female gods, so goddesses, are linked to moon worship. And there are places where Ashtaroth is linked to moon worship. And then, of course, the stars then become, in the trilogy, in the laying out of the story of all these gods and goddesses, they have children, right? Because they interact with one another in ways that produce children. And their children then are represented by stars and planets. And so then you might choose to worship one of those stars or those planets. I sure hope you guys are appreciating how creative I'm getting up here to be euphemistic. All right, so this is what he's warning against. Now, we read over that and we go, oh, it's just another god. They shouldn't worship the other god. But when we unpack what that included in worship, then we go back and we go, why did God, in say like Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20, when he gives this ethic for how you should interact with different people in intimate ways and how you should avoid interacting with people in certain intimate ways, why would he go through that? Because you should pursue righteousness and only righteousness. And some of these other gods have a different standard of what's right. And when the people of God abandon righteousness, only righteousness, and they pursue these other gods have standards too. These other gods have what they might call righteousness as well, or what's right in their eyes. And so your standard of righteousness changes, which means then your standard of justice changes, which means you're not going to uphold the things that God calls you to uphold. You're not going to execute justice where God calls you to execute justice because you're following a God who says it's okay. Okay? Wait till the end. We're going to unpack that one. All right. But hopefully you get the point here. Let's keep going. Verse 6. On the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses, the one who is to die shall be put to death. A person shall not be put to death on the evidence of one witness. So just because someone has a vendetta against another person, they can't just start something and they get put to death. Verse 7, the hand of the witnesses shall be the first. That really heightens the weight of being a witness. You don't simply get to say, I saw this person doing this, but I'd like to stay anonymous. The hand of the one who made the accusation is the first to throw stones. Okay? That really makes you think twice about what your story is going to be. And then afterward, the hand of all the people. So you shall purge the evil from your midst. That's a key phrase. It's going to show up in this next section again. Pursue righteousness. Righteousness is the foundation of justice. And then when we execute justice, it maintains righteousness. So as you execute justice, you stone the one who's worshiping other gods. You're purging the evil from your midst. You're executing justice, and in doing so, you're upholding or you're maintaining the righteousness of the people of God. You're not letting something seep in that's going to taint or corrupt the people of God. You're not permitting sin to dwell in the camp. You're not tolerating the worship of other gods. In Revelation 2 or 3, one of the churches that Jesus criticizes, he says, I have this against you. You tolerate that woman, Jezebel. It was not that they themselves were necessarily worshiping Jezebel. You tolerate her. You let her dwell here. You let people worship her or do things that are in line with her. You tolerate her. Moses leaves no room for toleration. Okay? You shall purge the evil from your midst. Okay, that's the first example. When you find someone who's worshiping other gods, you go after them. I'm going to summarize this next section because this section, what he's doing is he says, hey, there's going to come cases that are hard for you. It might be murder cases. He gives an example, homicide. It could be different types of cases of assault or legal matters. They might just be too hard for you to decide between. And if that's the case, then you send the person to the place that God designates. And that may be they go to Jerusalem where God may designate a different location in this case. But you go to that place where he designates. You're going to come to the Levitical priests because they also had a role in deciding civil matters. They weren't just ministers to the Lord with regard to the tabernacle temple. They also then would decide, help people decide between civil matters, things like that. So go to the Levitical priests and the judge in whatever location the Lord sends you. And then whatever that Levitical priest and that judge instruct you to do, you should do it. Okay, that's what Moses is saying here. You shall be careful to do according to all that they direct you. According to the instructions that they give you, and according to the decisions which they pronounce on you, you shall do. You shall not turn aside from the verdict that they declare to you. You don't get to go to them, get their verdict and say, don't like that one, can I try another? Can I appeal above you? Can I appeal to the next level? There's none of that. He says, once you get that verdict, you don't turn aside from it, because to do so, verse 12, would be to act presumptuously. And the root word that's translated there is the word that oftentimes gets translated pride. To act in a way that disregards the judgment of the priest and or the judge would be to act pridefully. Well, that's easy to see, right? Well, I don't trust what you just said. I know better. I'm going to go to something else until you tell me what I want to hear. Therefore, I'm the standard, which is measuring righteousness and justice. I'll know it when I hear it. I'll know it when I feel it. But Moses says, nope, you don't turn aside, you follow it. And so you shall purge the evil from Israel. The concern is, if you don't uphold justice, if you don't execute justice, and justice is based on pursuing righteousness and only righteousness, if you don't execute justice, then the people of God will have evil among them. They will be tainted, and righteousness will not be upheld, and they will not live in the land that God's giving them. They will not be able to stay in the land that God has given them. All right, so that's what we're looking at in Deuteronomy. Now, why do I spend time talking about Ashtaroth and Baal and all these other gods? Because you and I think that those are just names of gods, and we would say they're fake gods. That's an opinion. I understand that. I happen to believe they're real. They're real spiritual beings that are in rebellion against God, so demons who are posing as each of these gods, okay? So when they're worshiping, and I think that's Deuteronomy's view in chapter 32, and Paul in 1 Corinthians 10, where he says when you make sacrifices, they're sacrificing to demons. Okay? I base my understanding on that. Okay, so I think they're real little g gods. But we read that and we say, well, that was then, this is now. That's not true now. And it's just not the case. And so when you follow other gods, little g, and you abandon the pursuit of righteousness, your morality is impacted, your values are changed, and the way you live your life and the standards by which you live your life are being dictated and instructed by something else. Okay? So hence the instruction, pursue righteousness, only righteousness. Now, these little g gods like Ashtaroth, they're not gone. They're just called different names here. They're prevalent in other countries, but they just morph into whatever the culture needs it to happen. If you've watched any of the award show, the Hollywood award show, CMA awards, not CMA, well, country's pretty bad too. I mean, I like country, but the awards show is a little, I'm thinking like, what was it, the Oscars, the Emmys, one of those. They're putting it all on display. They're putting worship of other gods all on display. When you see them form up in a ring, that's a witch's coven. That is a circle that's formed, and within that circle you cast spells and you do magic. That's been around for centuries. When we talk about setting up fir trees next to the Lord your God, the people that go into the woods to worship because they're around trees that represent fertility, we've got people who do that today, here, in this community, right? Wiccans. Native Americans. There are things that are done to other gods, and it's linked to nature. And when we elevate nature and we worship nature, whether that's trees, whether that's the moon, whether that's the sun, almost every culture has a version of their sun god, S-U-N. Almost every culture has a sun god that they worship, right? We have this in the highest levels of this country. Boy, it's silent. We have this in the highest levels of this country. We think that we are a Christian nation, and if that was ever the case, it was with the founders. But it is not the case now. And we are not being ruled over by Christian principles. And the ones that are remaining are very quickly sliding away. Why? Because many people have abandoned pursuit of righteousness, only righteousness. So then what are they following? The other thing about some of these gods and goddesses is when you look at statues of the goddesses or gods, oftentimes they would have features that are both male and female on the same god. They're called androgynous. They're blending the genders, male and female. So, are you tracking with me all of a sudden now? Okay, so when you follow after a god or a goddess who values an androgynous type of living and a blurring of the genders, do you think that we might be seeing some of that playing out? Okay, it's not distant from us. We are not to be people who are sticking our head in the sand, ignoring what's going around. We must be aware. I'm not saying every person in the government is corrupt and pursuing unrighteous things. There are people. It's hard to be in it. I bless them. That's probably why we got to pray for them, because being in it is hard. But listen to me. We cannot be under an illusion that our country and our government is pursuing righteousness, only righteousness. You know it's not. I know it's not. You cannot be under the assumption that our schools and our administrators are all pursuing righteousness, only righteousness. You cannot be under the assumption that everything you read, even though it's called Christian, is Christian. You and I must test everything. What's the fruit of what's being taught? Does it tie to the scriptures? And then what's the fruit of what's being taught? Okay? So, also, this is just for awareness. It's not a morality statement. Some of these gods and goddesses from other countries, these pagan religions, they're represented as our superheroes, our avengers. I mean, I'm just saying so you're aware, right? Their storylines. Look at their storylines. What is it? Wonder Woman is like an Amazon woman who's a goddess, right? The Starbucks emblem. Oh, the Starbucks emblem. Yes, probably a siren, but if you trace some of where sirens come from, they're related to gods and goddesses from these pagan nations. And I read one guy who flat out said, the siren that is the emblem for Starbucks is a representation of Astarte. Astarte being another name for Ashtaroth. Oh my gosh, okay. But do you know where righteousness and justice come together beautifully? Do you know where righteousness and justice come together beautifully? In the gospel. Romans chapter 3, verse 21. But now the righteousness of God, the righteous character of God, the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law. Because in the law, you can see the righteous character of God. But now, apart from the law, the righteous character of God is also being manifest. Although the law and the prophets pointed to this. The righteousness of God that's through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. The pursuit of righteousness is rooted in the righteousness of God, which has been attested to in the law, the Torah, because there's nothing wrong with God's law. It's good and it's holy, Paul would say, right? So we can't dispute. It points us to the righteous character of God. The only way you and I have a moral standard, by the way, is because we have what's in the Old Testament. Okay? Because there are a lot of things that you and I stand on as moral standards that are not carried over into the New Testament. And that's a very bad argument to make when we say because something is not said and Jesus didn't address this in the New Testament, it's therefore null and void. Because none of us would want to do that when it comes to some of these things that we're battling in our society, because Jesus didn't have to address everything because he just assumed it was still being upheld among his audience, right? Okay, so the law points to this righteousness of God, and the prophets testified about it. Verse 22, that is the righteousness of God that comes through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. There's no distinction, he says, because everybody has sinned and falls short of God's glory. All are justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God put forward as a propitiation, big word to mean a sacrifice that satisfies the wrath of God, as a sacrifice that satisfies the wrath of God by his blood to be received by faith. I receive the righteousness of God, and the righteousness of God is upheld when I receive Jesus by faith. This was to show God's righteousness. Why? Paul's concerned. There was a concern about God's righteous character. And Jesus coming, even though the law pointed to the righteous standard of God and the righteous character of God, and the prophets called people back to it, now the righteous character of God is also being revealed in Jesus, who is God in the flesh. He is full deity in bodily form. Now, this was to show God's righteousness because in his divine forbearance, he had passed over former sins. It was to show his righteousness at the present time so that he might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. Righteousness and justice come together in the gospel in this way. God is righteous. That's never going to be compromised. It's never going to change. You and I can't change his righteous character. You and I cannot reach his righteous character on our own. So there's the problem. The righteousness of God and the sinfulness of humanity cannot mix. And when we pursue righteousness, only righteousness, what happens is we have to execute justice. God's no different. Because he's righteous, he must execute justice when that righteousness is violated. Okay? When I sin, because I'm corrupted by sin, I violate his righteousness. Therefore, he must execute justice against me. Okay? That would be just for him to do that. He cannot sweep my sin under the rug. He cannot overlook my sin. He cannot excuse it. He must deal with it justly. Otherwise, he compromises his righteousness. Hence the gospel. Jesus, the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus. What did God do with Jesus on the cross? He executed justice against sin. Mine and yours. So that he can uphold his righteousness while still being able to bring me and you in to his family. Righteousness and justice meet in the gospel. And so when the people of God are going to pursue righteousness and uphold justice, it reflects the gospel. I am required, I am bound to pursue righteousness and uphold justice because of the gospel. Because in the gospel is wedded together those two things. In the Old Testament, in the law, God has revealed his righteous character. None of that's changed, but the gospel has brought those together in a way that now I can be with God and I can live for God. And I must live for God in a way that reflects his righteousness and upholds his justice. If I do anything less, I am opposing the gospel. And I am opposing God. Okay? Righteousness is the foundation for justice. You want to have a country that upholds justice, not some of this, nope, we're done. Not some of that other stuff. You need to pursue righteousness first. Until we pursue righteousness, which is based on the righteous one, we will not have a correct standard of justice. That's all there is to that. And unless we uphold justice that's based on righteousness, we won't maintain our righteousness. That's true individually, that's true corporately, that's true as a people. So Holy Spirit, come and take your word and let it come and penetrate our hearts, the hardness of our hearts, the hardness of our minds, the arguments that we might be having right now with you or maybe even some with me. God, let that be put aside so that the word of God might be placed upon us, that we might understand it, that we might wrestle with it. And even if I can't understand it, or even if I don't currently agree with it, I must align with it. And so, Lord, help me to be humble, to come under your word, under you, that I might then live my life in accordance with your righteousness, that I might uphold your justice. And let that be true of us in our classrooms, in the ways that we speak and speak up for people and things or speak against things. Let that be true in our workplaces, in the ways that we speak up for people or speak into things. Let that be true in our communities, that we would not tolerate things, but instead purge the evil that is among us, that we would not be a people who are okay with being tainted and corrupted, but that we would pursue your righteousness, live in accordance with it, and then let others be drawn to it. because any other standard leads to death. Any other standard leads to destruction and the degrading of society and the degrading of people made in the image of God. So come have your way with us. In Jesus' name, amen. See you guys.